George pointed his finger and laughed, turning a couple's anniversary into a cruel joke for the internet. He didn't notice the silent man standing behind him until the music stopped. Frederick Thompson knew George's name, his job, and his boss. "I hope that video was worth it," Frederick whispered, "because you just traded your career for 15 seconds of hate." The look on George's face? Absolute terror. Subscribe to the channel to join the fight against prejudice and racial profiling. George Howard didn't care about the taste of his steak, he cared about the angle of his camera. He sat back in his chair, propping his phone against a water glass, and angled the lens toward a table about 10 feet away. At that table sat Johnson and Linda, a couple who had spent the last hour quietly talking and laughing over their meal. They were dressed well, Johnson in a sharp navy blazer and Linda in a deep green dress, but to George, they were just props for his Monday night live stream. He tapped the screen to check his viewer count, seeing it climb past 3,000. He leaned into the microphone, his voice loud enough to carry across the neighboring tables. "You guys see this?" George said, a smug grin spreading across his face as he pointed a finger directly at the couple. "This is what happens to a neighborhood. You build something nice, and suddenly, people think a rented suit and a credit card give them a seat at the table. They're trying so hard to look like they belong, but you can see the effort from a mile away." Linda was mid-sentence when she heard his voice. She froze, her fork hovering over her plate. Johnson, who had been listening intently to his wife, slowly turned his head. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at George, then at the phone pointed at them, and then back at George's laughing face. The confusion on Johnson's face lasted only a second before it settled into a look of genuine, visible hurt. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, and being turned into a spectacle in the middle of a quiet dinner clearly blindsided him. George didn't flinch. In fact, seeing Johnson's reaction only made him more animated for his audience. "Oh, look," George whispered loudly into the phone, "the gentleman is upset. I think I hurt his feelings by telling the truth. Stay tuned, guys, this is about to get interesting." He kept his finger extended, waving it toward them like he was identifying a specimen in a zoo, completely indifferent to the fact that he was dismantling a stranger's piece for the sake of digital clout. Johnson looked down at his hands, gripped the edge of the table, and took a long, shaky breath, while George just kept the camera rolling, waiting for the next reaction to feed his followers. George was just getting started on a second riff about how decorum is dead when the light over his table dimmed. A broad shadow stretched across his phone screen, obscuring the image of Johnson and Linda. Without breaking his gaze from the camera lens or stopping his commentary, George snapped his fingers blindly toward the figure standing at his shoulder. "Refill the water, kid, and bring more bread." "We're working here," George muttered, his eyes fixed on the rising likes count on his screen. He expected to hear the clink of a pitcher or a mumbled apology. Instead, there was a heavy, deliberate silence that seemed to pull the air right out of the room. "I'm not the waiter," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it had a resonant, low-end weight that cut straight through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "And you're done filming?" George's smirk faltered. He looked up, squinting against the overhead lights, and saw Frederick Thompson. Frederick didn't look like a man about to start a shouting match. He stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his suit tailored with a precision that George's own off-the-rack jacket couldn't touch. He wasn't aggressive, but he was immovable. Frederick was looking down at George with a curious, clinical expression, the way an entomologist might look at a particularly destructive beetle. George felt a flash of heat in his neck. He tried to reclaim his bravado for the sake of the live audience still watching from the phone propped up on the table. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm a customer," George said, his voice pitching slightly higher. "I'm just documenting my experience. You should be happy for the free promotion." Frederick didn't blink. He didn't look at the camera, and he didn't address the viewers. His focus remained entirely on George. "You aren't documenting an experience, George. You're harassing my guests," Frederick said, his calm never wavering. "And in my house, we don't treat people like props." The realization that this man knew his name hit George like a physical blow, and for the first time that night, the arrogant man's finger stopped pointing. The shadow wasn't just blocking the light anymore, it felt like it was closing in on George's entire world. George tried to force a laugh, looking back at his phone screen to see if his followers were enjoying the standoff. "It's a free country, pal," he said, his voice carrying a desperate edge of bravado. "I'm a paying customer, and I have the right to film in public. Maybe you should spend less time hovering and more time making sure the service isn't so slow." He reached for his wine glass, trying to look unbothered, but his fingers grazed the stem with a noticeable tremor. Frederick didn't move an inch. He didn't reach for George's phone or try to block the lens. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his own device. "You're a customer until I decide you're a trespasser," Frederick said, his voice as steady as a surgeon's. "And that transition happens the moment I tell you to leave. But before we get to that, let's talk about your professional standards." "I know that face, George. I've seen it on the Miller and Associates internal portal." George's hand stopped dead. The wine glass sat untouched. He looked up at Frederick, the smirk finally sliding off his face like melting wax. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, but the confidence was gone. "You're the lead on the new regional campaign for the logistics group, aren't you?" Frederick asked, looking down at his phone screen as he scrolled through a contact list. "I sat through a 3-hour board meeting last Thursday where your name was brought up 3 times. You see, George, I don't just run this restaurant. I'm the majority stakeholder in the firm that handles your company's commercial real estate. In fact, I'm the one who signed off on your department's budget expansion last month." The color drained from George's cheeks until he looked physically ill. The reality of the situation hit him with the weight of a falling building. The man he had been treating like a servant, the man whose guests he had been mocking for not belonging, was a silent architect of George's own career path. George looked at his phone, still live streaming, and suddenly the thousands of viewers felt like thousands of witnesses to his professional suicide. He reached out with a shaky hand and fumbled with the screen, ending the broadcast with a panicked tap, but the damage was already done. He wasn't looking at a waiter anymore, he was looking at the man who could end his lifestyle with a single email. Frederick tapped a name on his screen and hit the speaker icon. He held the phone out in the middle of the air between them, as if it were a judge's gavel. The ringing tone echoed through the immediate area, drawing the eyes of nearby diners who had sensed the shift in the room's energy. George sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the phone as if it were a live grenade. "Robert here," a voice barked through the speaker. It was a voice George heard every Monday morning in the boardroom, the voice of the man who signed his mortgage checks. "Hey, Robert." "It's Frederick," Frederick said, his voice remains flat and professional. "I'm standing in my restaurant right now. I've got one of your employees, George Howard, sitting at my table. He's spent the last 20 minutes filming a live stream mocking several of my guests with some pretty hateful rhetoric. I thought you'd want a chance to see the footage before it hits the internet and your firm's brand is permanently attached to it." There was a silence on the other end of the line that felt longer than it actually was. George's breathing became shallow. He wanted to reach out and grab the phone, to apologize, to explain it was just a joke for his followers, but his muscles wouldn't move. He felt the weight of every person in the room watching him. "Is he still there?" Robert's voice finally came through. It was no longer the voice of a friendly business associate, it was cold and final. "He's sitting right in front of me," Frederick replied. "Fire him," Robert said. "George, if you can hear me, don't bother coming in tomorrow. We'll mail your things." "Frederick, I am incredibly sorry for the embarrassment. Send me the clip, our legal team will handle the rest." The line went dead with a sharp beep. Frederick lowered the phone and slid it back into his pocket. He didn't look triumphant, he looked disappointed. George remained slumped in his chair, his phone, the source of his supposed power, lying face down on the table like a piece of plastic junk. The digital audience he had been trying to impress was gone, and in their place was a room full of real people who now saw him for exactly what he was. George didn't move. He sat in a silence so heavy it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. There was no applause, no shouting, and no grand speech from the other diners. There was just a room full of people watching him with a mixture of pity and disgust. George looked down at his phone, realizing he had never actually ended the stream. The screen was still active, capturing a close-up of his own trembling hands as they hovered over his half-eaten dinner. The comments were scrolling by too fast to read, a blur of red and white text as his followers turned on him in real time. Frederick leaned in, placing one hand on the edge of the table. He didn't loom over George, he spoke in a quiet, conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than a scream. "The bill for those 2 tables you mocked, Johnson and Linda's, and the couple behind you, is now on your tab," Frederick said. "You're going to pay for their entire evening. It's the least you can do for the interruption." He straightened his tie and gestured toward the front entrance. "Pay the check, and never step foot on my property again. If I see your face in any of my establishments, I won't call your boss next time. I'll call the police for trespassing." George fumbled for his wallet, his fingers clumsy as he fished out a credit card. He didn't look up at Frederick, and he certainly didn't look at Johnson, who was still sitting quietly with his wife, watching the scene with a tired, somber expression. George handed the card to a waiter who had appeared like a ghost at his side. The transaction felt like it took hours. When the receipt finally came, George signed it with a jagged, unrecognizable scrawl. He picked up his phone, shoved it into his pocket without looking at the screen, and stood up. His legs felt like lead. As he walked toward the door, the only sound was the rhythmic click of his shoes on the floor. He passed the tables he had spent the last hour ridiculing, but he kept his eyes fixed on the exit sign. He pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the cool night air. There was no viral hit waiting for him, no wave of support from the internet, and no job to go to in the morning. He stood on the sidewalk, a middle-aged man who had traded his entire career for a few minutes of feeling superior, and for the first time in his life, he had absolutely nothing to say. What we just witnessed with George Howard isn't just a story about a bad night at a restaurant, it's a case study in how social psychology plays out in the digital age. George was operating under a classic in-group/out-group bias. In his mind, he was part of an exclusive circle, and by belittling Johnson and Linda, he thought he was reinforcing his own status and strengthening his bond with his followers. He viewed the people at the next table as an outgroup, props to be used for his own social gain. But George made the mistake that many people make in an interconnected world. He assumed the people he was mocking held no power over his life. The reality of the modern professional landscape is that the outgroup you choose to target might very well be the gatekeeper to your future. Frederick Thompson wasn't just a stranger, he was a silent pillar of the very industry George relied on for his paycheck. In a business setting, prejudice and harassment aren't just moral flaws, they are massive liabilities. No CEO, no matter how much they like a regional campaign, is going to risk their company's brand and partnerships to protect an employee who has proven themselves to be a public relations nightmare. When Frederick made that call, he wasn't just being a good guy, he was removing a toxic element from a professional network that thrives on mutual respect and stability. This leads us to the ultimate takeaway: your digital reputation is no longer separate from your physical character. We live in an era where everyone is carrying a camera and a microphone, and the private moments we think we're sharing with a curated audience can instantly become the evidence used against us in a court of public and professional opinion. Before you hit record, before you post that edgy commentary, or before you point a finger at a stranger to gain a few likes, you have to ask yourself a very real question: is this 15 seconds of attention worth my entire livelihood? Character is the person you are when you think the cameras are off and the lights are low. Reputation is what happens when someone like Frederick Thompson finally turns the lights on. George Howard walked out of that restaurant with a total loss of dignity because he forgot that in a world where everything is recorded, there is no such thing as an invisible victim. Don't let a moment of online bravado cost you a lifetime of hard work. If you believe that respect should be the standard in every room, then join our community. Frederick Thompson proved that when you build a legacy of integrity, you gain the power to silence bullies and protect the innocent. Don't miss the next time we witness accountability in action. We share stories of justice and real-world karma to remind us all that character matters. Subscribe now to stand with those who choose class over chaos. Reach that subscribe button. Don't let the story end here.